Hey there, everyone, and welcome to our Balance Livestream with the Balance team here for our Year-1 anniversary update. My name is John. I'm one of the community managers on the team. And if you don't recognize these folks from some of the last Balance chats that we've done, let's do some quick introductions. Jason, who are you and what do you do on Company of Heroes?
Hello. I'm Jason. I go by the handle Tarnations, and I'm the balance lead on Company of Heroes 3.
And Darren, who are you? What do you do?
Hey, I'm Darren. I'm one of the game designers on Company of Heroes 3. I help with the balance, and you might know me as Mirage Flaw back in the day. Still am.
Still am. Well, welcome back, folks. I know we've got a lot of stuff to cover today, but before we do that, as always, if you want to stay up to date with everything that we're doing, be sure to follow us on your social platform of choice at Company of Heroes. You can find our forums at community.companyofheroes.com. We will also be posting the patch notes there, so you can follow along with those as we talk about those today. Of course, you can join our Discord server, our discord.gg/Company of Heroes, and follow us on Twitch at twitch.tv/Company of Heroes. So like we mentioned, today we're going to be covering the multiplayer balance changes that are coming to the Year-1 anniversary update, or Update 1.5. We'll be talking about changes for all four factions, some of the shakeups for existing battle groups, and some new experimental changes. And I think that's all I'm going to say for now. So Jason, I think the first big question that we always like to ask you anytime we have balance changes in the game is kind of like, what were your and Darren's sort of overall team goals with this update in terms of balance?
Mm-hmm. So this general patch is kind of aimed towards doing a few things. Mm-hmm. The primary one is we have a minor overhaul of some of our battle groups from launch, and then we have some major changes to the Brits, specifically to some of their more underused units, and then we have some general changes to the rest of the factions.
I'm going to switch over here to my very fancy PowerPoint presentation. So you just covered sort of those three main key areas that we're going to talk about today. Mm-hmm. Darren, before we kind of get into specifics, did you have anything else to say about these areas of focus? You know, were there any sort of like big impactful changes that are coming to multiplayer that you want players to know about?
For the Brit ballot, in particular, as Jason said, we're primarily targeting their more underused units, so hopefully this should tune up some of the British, but in a way that diversifies their strategies rather than keeping them to a particular play style. So we're hoping our changes will give the British like more build order options.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. But before we kind of get into maybe some of the faction by faction specific details, were there any sort of general changes coming to the game that you wanted to touch on?
Overall, I think this time around we strayed away from doing anything too systemic.
Okay.
We're mostly kind of still letting the dust settle with the major changes that went in with 1.4 and kind of seeing how those kind of work out in the long run. One of the interesting things that has happened on this current patch is that we've seen quite a few things change over the course of the patch. And even in the last month or so, we've seen notable mutations in how people play.
Okay.
So yeah, this patch is going to be a little bit less on the big systemic changes, but there's still some major ones to shake up things.
I am kind of curious, like what have been some of your observations about how people have been playing since Steel Shepherd and how that's sort of evolved?
Well, one of the funniest things to me is like how DAC has just grown stronger and stronger as people really figured out some of the things we added to them.
Yeah.
How to really exploit them. And also we've seen more recently in the last few weeks, some adaptations from Allies players of like how to deal with this. So yeah, for me, it's really cool to see people push and pull with the meta.
Yeah. What about you, Darren? Any sort of things that you've noticed over the last month or so with Steel Shepherd?
At least for the new battle groups, I think people have been finding ways to counter them or different ways to play against them. So these two battle groups in particular, or particularly in Coastal, you don't play the same way that you would fight Coastal compared to how you would fight the rest of the standard Wehrmacht loadout.
Right. Okay, so I think we should probably just get into some of the faction changes here. So do we want to start with maybe more general changes that are coming to the U.S. forces?
Yeah, good old USF. You want to start, Darren?
Yeah, so for USF, we're not really giving them like a big changes as a whole, but we're trying to do some things to bring back the air support center in some way. So particularly, we are allowing like the first recon run level to just always provide vision to the player. So you no longer need to upgrade it to get vision. The Americans can always just go to the air support center and always have a constant vision tool that will be able to spot further artillery off maps and other or available units and abilities.
Mhm.
And we're also slightly buffing back the P-47 strafing run now that we have a proper anti-air that can counter the ability.
Yeah, so a little bit more depth from the air, but also now that we actually have some meaningful counterplay, we're bringing it back ever so slightly. It's not as strong as it was back in its peak, so hopefully we don't trigger anyone's PTSD there. Hopefully we'll keep an eye on this because like the new AA has kind of it's still settling in terms of how people are kind of engaging with it. So again, this is something we'll be tracking. But just for reference, for the recon run, we've actually flipped the way it worked between the upgraded and non-upgraded versions. So now you get the low flying plane by default, and then you get a high flying plane that is actually harder to shoot down as the upgraded version. We found the old version of it not really intuitive, and in a lot of scenarios, kind of you upgrade it to make it almost worse in a way. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great to know. What other stuff is maybe coming to some of the core roster units?
Yeah. Outside of that, we don't really have any huge changes to the units. I believe we have some minor tune-ups up and down for the Chaffee, the 4x4, and the Sherman. The 4x4, the Chaffee in particular, we're increasing its target size ever so slightly because we've noted that in some matchups they are overperforming. Though we do think a big portion of why the light vehicle spam is so good for Americans comes down to the U.S. armored, which we'll cover in the battle group changes, and we do have some more major changes in that regard to kind of really because we've noticed that in recent days that the meta really revolves around armored in particular. So we do have some changes targeting that.
Okay, cool. Do we want to just get into battle groups right now, Darren?
Yeah, let's go into it.
Okay.
Yeah. You want to go?
Do we want to go on to special operations?
Yeah, let's start with Spec Ops.
So special operations, this is mainly a change that we wanted to do. We wanted to differentiate the special operations strafe from the air support center. So if anyone remembers the assault support strafe from Company of Heroes 2, this is very much how the special operation and strafing run will now act. You'll have 2 planes that loiter the area to shoot at infantry. It's not a high damage anti-infantry strafe, but it is enough to pin and suppress units and essentially deny the area to enemy troop movements, and it should now also be worth its cost. Where before, if you had like double ASC upgrades, you pretty much had the same effect on the P-47 strafing run.
Right. So now a loiter versus a standard sort of call it. Okay. Okay. Cool. And what about armored battle group? I think I have a side by side here with some of the big changes.
Yeah, if you could jump to that. Yeah, awesome. So we've done a few changes, one of which we'll kind of I think we'll get into the really meat of that a little bit later.
Yeah.
I'm sure players can kind of see something in that corner there. But for now, the major changes that are coming to it are that fast deploy is now no longer 0 CP. So the double jeeps will stop terrorizing Wehrmacht in particular. We've changed some of the CPs around to make some of the things a little bit more attractive. And anything else? Am I missing?
We did some speed bonus nerfs across the board for Seek and Destroy and Storm.
And then since it's already there, I will mention that we have added an alternative to the E8, or at least the E8 colon that allows you to produce E8s from the tech structure directly. So this won't replace the old change, but this will be an added alternative, but with no CP cost. Because we'll get into a more detailed discussion of this a little bit later. But the primary idea was we didn't like the fact that we had to punish players who weren't tech skipping. We could only balance it around the power of the ability around tech skippers. because that was the best way to use it, right? But then we were kind of punishing everyone else who wanted to use the E8 as a cool unit, right?
Right.
So we wanted to create an alternative where we could balance the two playstyles separately. So we could still balance around the call-in playstyle, but not punish people who just want to build an E8 through the tech structure.
Okay. Like you said, maybe let's circle back to this discussion about that change specifically at the end, because I know we have a lot more to cover, and we can probably talk about this specific change probably for like half an hour. Okay, so Darren, was there anything else about the armored battle group that you want to cover, or should we just move to the Wehrmacht?
No, there's nothing really else about armor we really need to cover. I think you've already covered the fast deploy change, which should reduce the strength of like early 4x4 and particularly 1v1 game modes.
Yeah, and the speed decrease to search and destroy should hopefully tone back quite how devastating Hellcat or Chaffee rushes can be with this battle group, which we've noted to be particularly problematic. So yeah, we're kind of toning all these back. We'll still be keeping a close eye on it, but yeah.
Okay, all right. So let's jump into the Wehrmacht then. What changes are coming here?
So for Wehrmacht, really for this patch, we're not really changing them up too much for the most part. Most of their meaningful changes are coming in the battle group. We've only done really just minor tune-ups and tone downs for like the Whirlwind's going to cost a little bit more fuel to reflect its price, and like the artillery officer for the coastal will now take a little bit more time for the first barrage to hit you, giving you more time to dodge. Though I think the biggest one for Wehrmacht is we're blocking locking the communication cable behind an increased munition cost, so you can't get it early game
For the Kettenkrad.
Yeah, for the Kettenkrad, because we're noticing like people would just pump out the Kettenkrad, and it would give Wehrmacht a lot of map control very early in the game for 25 munition investment for how early it hits the field and for how fast it is in the game. But we still want to keep it as a speedy scout unit.
Right.
Yeah. And in compensation, because we noted that the Kettenkrad was kind of the capturing crutch for the faction, we've made Grenadiers go from 1 capture rate to 1.25, which still isn't quite as fast as a regular mainline unit, but it is it's significantly better than it was before. So hopefully, like overall, we want to make it so that Wehrmacht isn't as tied to their Kettenkrad. We've noted that at high level play, a lot of their success comes down to how well they use their Kettenkrad, which is great, but we don't want to make it so that you must go Kettenkrad to stay viable and early.
Yeah.
So that's kind of that change.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Do we want to get into some of the battle group changes? I know you mentioned the artillery officer. Were there any other specific changes you wanted to get into before we talk about the mechanized battle group?
No, I think most of the other ones are minor. Yeah.
Okay. So let's jump to this before and after for mechanized, because again, there are some pretty interesting changes here.
Yeah.
So,
sorry. Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
For mechanized, they're getting their abilities replaced. So we're giving mechanized the ability to have their light vehicles to repair other vehicles that are nearby. So it incentivizes either going half tracks or scout cars to act as a repair unit, or keep them in the late game to act as those mobile repair stations for your heavier vehicles.
Okay.
In addition, we're also swapping one part of the tree. So like the mechanized assault and the zeroing artillery are being swapped with the row where the Westby and the STG-44 are. Or so that will allow the Westby to arrive earlier for the Wehrmacht, giving them like a nice battle group to get early in direct fire units.
Okay.
As well as pushing back some of their more powerful abilities in the mechanized battle group.
Okay. And it looks like, looking at that new icon, it looks like the Stug comes with some Stoßtruppen. Is that right?
Yes. The Stug call-in has now been changed, so it's no longer Panzer Grenadiers, it's now Stoßtruppen.
Okay.
So, which should make this a lot more exciting for players. We've actually also kept the cost fairly low, so you get a meaningful discount using this, because it does arrive at a very interesting time for the Wehrmacht. So we want to incentivize players that kind of build around this call-in to kind of shape the way their mid-game plays, and hopefully give mechanized a distinct alternative style to the 8-Rad, which has been pretty much dominant for how do you play this.
So just to note, it is already in game, but now players will be able to tell that this thing now comes with Stoßtruppen.
Okay, cool. And I think there's also the in the bottom left there's that same change for the Panther.
Yes.
So do you want to touch on that now, or just
Yeah.
save that for a bit?
Just mechanically, it's the same thing as the E8. It allows you to build it straight from your tier 4, but we'll leave the detailed discussion for later.
Okay. Any final things about the Wehrmacht before we move on?
We have some minor nerfs to coastal, but I think you actually mentioned them.
Yeah, they're only minor nerfs to
Okay.
coastal.
Mhm.
We're hoping more that add what's the buffs to some British units that it will, at least for the British faction, it'll allow them to tackle coastal a lot better.
Mhm.
Okay.
Speaking of which,
yeah, speaking of the British, I know you mentioned that this was sort of a more of a key focus for this update. So lay it on me. What are we doing to buff my British boys?
So I'll first start, but at a high level, we've basically adjusted. Oh boy, a good half of the roster. It's not like we overhauled every unit, but we've given all the units a bit of a touch up or down, kind of to adjust how you especially how you tackle the early game with this faction. We've noted that like the viable ways of playing this faction have kind of been shaved down over time because certain units weren't performing as well, or certain other units, like we buffed certain playstyles in other factions.
Right.
So a lot of these changes are to kind of bring back a strong kind of free-flowing Brit early game that allows you to kind of opt into what you want to do rather than being forced into, hey, I have to do this or I will lose to extrat kind of gameplay.
Okay.
But for some details, Darren, you want to start?
do we want to go on to the infantry section then for a bunch of our details?
Sure, yeah.
So we're buffing a lot of like the underused upgrades and abilities and units for the British,
Mhm.
particularly for the infantry section. We feel their scope rifles and boys anti-tank rifles are fine, and in the early game they're just good enough to get by. But later into the game, like the Bren gun was not performing as it should,
Right.
and the Bren gun, it has always been designed to be like the premier anti-infantry upgrade for the Tommies that helps them scale.
Mhm.
So now we are making adjustments to the Bren gun in particular, or so that this is the upgrade you want if you want your Tommies to compete with most other
Mhm.
infantry into the mid to late game. You will buy the Bren gun, and for that combat power, or the Recce package is there for the utility, and the boys is there to act as soft anti-tank.
That sounded like a threat. You will buy the brain gun.
Darren's emphasis on this, yeah. Like one of the original problems was, while it was sometimes worth its cost, it often felt like a compromise when you got the Bren gun. Like it was your best option, but it wasn't an attractive option.
Yeah.
Now we've kind of made it so that it's a little bit cheaper and it's a little bit better. So it's something you really want to go for, but the choice is still there, right? If you go for the Bren gun, you're losing on either AT or utility. And it's also still the most expensive upgrade by far. So yeah, this should kind of like lifen up the IS, especially in the mid game where we've noticed that they can struggle sometimes against certain units.
Mhm.
So this should kind of bring them to par.
Okay. What else are we doing here?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
Royal Engineers, they're getting a minor health boost. This should help them against certain small arms, but not going to help them against all small arms. But the big thing is we're increasing their capture rate for this. So this is going to pair well with our next point later on as the change to Royal Engineers is going to give the British a bit more capping power in the early game, allowing them to take those points more quickly,
Mhm.
especially with the first sapper, or going into a second sapper is also can be useful as like your fast capping build for the British now.
Mhm.
Now that they do have that increased capture power and the fact they're available from the HQ at the start of the game.
Right.
Kind of similar to before, we found that any kind of build that tried to get sappers early would get punished overly too much. You do get like a powerful kind of assault unit that a lot of the other factions can't really get early, but the costs were a little too high, so we've basically never saw it after a certain point. So hopefully this is to bring this back so that you have some flexibility with some ideas of getting engineers early.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about the Dingo Scout?
Yeah.
So this is where the engineers pair particularly well.
Oh,
at least
man.
From our playtest.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize if we put all our changes together forms almost like a whole paragraph. But,
So for the Dingo, we've done some major improvements to its weapons responsiveness. So we've toned that up quite a bit. But we've also increased its damage, so it is going to be on par with the other ultralight scout units. Before it was less than those units because it did have that previously much higher armor, though that has been lost over time. So your Dingo will be effective as a combat unit. And we want to keep the Dingo as a combat scout. We don't want it to be like a capture vehicle like the other factions have. So the Dingo is particularly geared to be used as a combat vehicle. We did have to do some minor changes to it, like increase its cost very slightly. And we did some health and armor adjustment. And so it's just a little bit easier to ward off, but still keep some durability because with the new sappers who are capping behind the Dingo, the Dingo can prove to be very oppressive against certain units because it forces your infantry to remain in cover. It's very effective against infantry who are out of cover. And it can also be used to either hunt down other ultralight vehicles, forcing them off capture points, or against the DAC, you can just try to hunt the 250 with it.
Right. So
it will generally win.
So is the intent here to sort of use your Dingo to screen for engineers that are capping behind you?
So the idea of the Dingo is this idea of being able to trade off some of your early capping for really basically overpowered combat unit. So the trade-off is I will give up some of my map control. Right. In exchange, it's a gamble to see if I can deny you more.
Right.
And that's kind of the main dynamic of the Dingo is this idea of like, I will try and do as much damage to you early as I can. And then, because the Dingo eventually will die. Well, unless you're amazing. But like and also it has some of the lower utility of our ultralight scouts, especially now that we've given the Jeep the scout commander, which is the intent. Like the Dingo is this early game gamble that players can go for. If you go for one, or if you're really looking for a different game, you can go for two, and try and really trade in and get some good damage early. In exchange, you don't get ISs out early, you don't get their veterancy scaling as fast, and also you lose out on capping. That's kind of the main idea. A lot of the changes, though, are not all just buffs. A lot of them are just to change so that the responsiveness of the unit is a lot better. We've noted through multiple patches that either it can't shoot units off its arc. Like there was a whole patch where it struggled to kind of like retarget. Yeah. And it should be a lot better than before. It's still a fixed arc light vehicle, so it can be a little bit hard to use, but it should be significantly more mobile.
Okay. Darren, any other thoughts on the Dingo before we move on?
Yeah, so the Dingo, even if it does fall off a little bit, because it's able to achieve that veterancy and fight as a scout, that combat scout, it will still be very effective in the scouting role because the Dingo is the only scouting unit of the four factions that always has its increased vision, and you don't have to do anything to get it. So even if once your Dingo has done enough damage and you don't want to pull it back, to be withdrawn,
it still has some.
You can still keep it around for the ability to either harass like lone capture squads or provide like constant vision to like the slower British army and their team weapons.
It also gives Brits kind of a high micro unit early on because infantry sections and sappers can be a little slow at times. So we wanted to give players also an option that's kind of like a little bit a lot more high risk, high reward than their regular options. Which kind of brings us to our next unit, which serves a very similar role, but a little bit higher up, which is the Humber. You want to start with the changes?
So we did a bunch of changes to the Humber. We wanted to still keep it as a fast-moving anti-infantry scout vehicle, but we didn't want it to be like resistant to anti-tank fire. So we've done some changes to make it more readily available, so losing your first Humber is not going to be like game ending for the British player.
Okay. Yeah.
But we're also doing things like increasing its speed, giving it increased vision, so it can either run away from those spotted threats that's much earlier or run down other unit. It's chasing after. And we've also done some like the big thing we've done for the Dingo is the Humber is increase its armor in particular. So this is going to help it a lot against like the autocannon in vehicles. In particular, this allows the Humber to actually duel the flak half track that the DAC has. So if the DAC goes a flak half track but overextends, the Humber is capable of both running down the flak flak half track or beating it out up in a head-on duel if the flak has like nothing to spot for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's gonna be this kind of lightweight, high micro punch unit.
Okay.
That we've noted that can get a lot of value in the hands of like really good players. So we're gonna be keeping a close eye on this one in particular. But we've noted that like this unit has struggled to kind of catch on because it is a lot of micro required to get proper value out of the unit. But we also know that with the proper micro, this unit can be really good. So we're keeping an eye on it. But yeah, like Darren said, we made it so that it's a lot better against, well, it's not meant to counter, for example, a lot of the Axis light vehicles that arrive. So the 8-rad and the flak half-track, for example, will still be pretty good against the Humber. But the Humber now has some teeth to it in this relationship, particularly the flak half-track. If you're not ready, like if you're not stationary and if you're not sighted, for example, the Humber can beat the flak half-track in certain scenarios. So beware.
And I'll just add another point. We've also increased the Humber's reliability. There was a weird thing going on with our Humber where it was only good against large squads, but now
Oh, the incremental.
we
yeah.
removed its incremental accuracy, so this will make the Humber consistent against most infantry squads, regardless of their size.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think next up here we have the Stuart light tank.
That was more of a minor change. So the Stuart had 3 effects to its tread shot. We're changing it to 1, so it's like straightforward to use on how you want to use tread shot rather than, all right, am I at range 25?
Mhm.
Am I at range 10? Am I at range 35?
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to gauge. And with how fast vehicles can move
Yeah.
to get out of range of the Stuart, or who will be trying to back up if you're trying to use tread shot, it was more ideal just to keep it to 1 effect that is good against all targets at like regardless of where you hit them.
Mhm.
But only you get that 1 effect.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else in the core roster that you wanted to touch on before we get to battle groups?
Yeah. So we got to get to the big one.
The grant.
We got to get to the grant.
Yeah, it's down there. So we've noted that this vehicle has been a little bit overshadowed by its compatriots in the Matilda and the Crusader. While those tanks have very clear identities and also very good in those identities, the Grant has struggled a little bit throughout the game to kind of find its role. And these changes are meant to kind of cement it as the firepower tank of the Brits.
Okay.
So we've given it some extra health, and we've increased basically its firepower by increasing the pen on the main gun and also increasing the teeth on the secondary gun. The secondary gun still is a light 37 mil, so it's not going to be destroying your Tiger or anything like that. But with the added stats to it, it's more something more equivalent to like a Stuart weapon, which doesn't sound amazing until you realize these are one vehicle with 2 weapons,
Right.
and they can very, very quickly add up to both anti-vehicle and anti-infantry rolls, especially if you roll the RNG. Sometimes you can get some significant alpha damage on either infantry or vehicles. And the idea is to really cement the Grant as this vehicle that, while not as mobile as the Crusader or not nearly as tanky as the Matilda, it is a standalone unit that has the firepower to really kick off late game Axis units.
Right. When you say alpha damage, you mean like that first strike against
Yes.
an enemy?
Yeah. Beware, because you're getting hit by 2 tank guns the moment you encounter the Grant, especially if you're pushing into it, for example, which can really catch you off guard in times. It has in our playtesting, for example.
Yeah. Looking at these changes, it definitely makes it a lot more enticing. I always feel like, oh, do I want to tech into the Grant, or should I just use the tanks I already have? Yeah.
So for the Grant, I will speak on this as well. We wanted to make the Grant feel less like I am a medium with that second gun. Now you are more in class with the advanced medium. So you can think of tanks like the Easy 8 or fully upgraded Panzer IVs. Or so this puts the Grant on par with like those endgame tanks. So,
Gotcha.
Because this is at the very end of the British tech tree. So we wanted to feel rewarding. So if you unlock the Grant, like very few units are going to be able to challenge the Grant head on in a duel, except for like maybe the heaviest Axis tanks. But even then, the Grant, at least when supported, can provide enough fire support to lay down some significant damage if you're not paying attention to it.
But it still can't do what the other tanks can do. So it's not nearly as fast as Crusader. So if you want hit and run, you still need to use the Crusader. And it's not as nearly as good as an enabler as the Matilda is. So it doesn't have something like smoke. It doesn't have the durability the Matilda has. So it should still very much play differently. In fact, like Darren said, when you go the Grant, you kind of want to play around them. Rather than usually when you go the Matilda, you play around, the Matilda, or in some ways the Matilda plays around the rest of your army, in that sense. But so hopefully we're adding finally the third piece into the trifecta of tanks that the Brits can use, to spice up their late game here.
Yeah. Any other final things with the British changes that we want to touch on?
Anything?
Mainly just minor changes. We just toned up a little bit of like the training center for at least the light vehicle and team weapons. So they're going to have fewer bonuses, but the bonuses are going to be much larger for what you get. And so they're worth their price. In particular, team weapons are going to get that extra health and a significant rate of fire bonus. And light vehicles get a major bonus to how much experience they all get at the start, in addition to having significant mobility and accuracy increases.
Okay, cool. So I feel like, just personally looking at all these changes, I feel like the Brits are back. It definitely feels like a significant overhaul and buff to the core roster already. But let's maybe talk about the battle groups. Do you want me to show off the before and after here of the heavy armor?
Yeah.
All right, let's jump to that. So some minor changes here. Darren, do you want to touch on what we've done here?
You want to touch on this?
Sure.
More your focus?
So we swapped around a few abilities to kind of make some of the choices a little bit more competitive. So we noted that, for example, the sapper or the veterancy pick basically had no competition. It was something like 92 to 8% pick rate or something like that. So we kind of wanted to make that choice a little bit more compelling. So we swapped those around, and we also wanted to make it so that it was a lot easier to get into that light vehicle recall, because we do think that does enable you to do quite a lot of different play styles early on, whether that be extra dingoes or emphasis on Humbers, or even the CWT truck with the AA gun on top of it. All of those become a lot more interesting or a lot more viable once you have access to this ability. So we're like, okay, well, before you had to double invest to really go into it and really slow down your column. But now we've kind of worked backwards from that. It's like, okay, you still need to delay it, but now it is significantly more appetizing to get. So we're hoping to see this kind of change up how you play Armored early on. There's kind of more ways to play Armored than just relying on that 4 or 5 CP timing. And there's some more emphasis on early game stuff, where you can go early sappers and the recall, where you can go early, a heavy emphasis on engineers and light vehicles, especially now that we've given engineers better capping as well. So an engineer heavy build with vehicles is a lot more viable as well. To see kind of if a vehicle focused kind of Brits gameplay, because we haven't really seen that really take off too much. I know USF kind of has the reverse, where it has too much of that, but we're trying to introduce a little bit of that to the Brits.
Okay, Darren, any thoughts on those changes?
We've also done some minor tune-ups to the heavier vehicles that are found in the roster, so we've reverted quite a few of the changes to the Crusader anti-air. Because previously it was just on par with the Whirlwind, but given its increased cost over the Whirlwind, it didn't make sense for it to generally be worse in most cases. And we've also slightly tuned up the bog standard Churchill. So it's going to take a bit less of your population, and it's going to fire a little bit faster, so it will be able to fight off tanks and infantry a bit easier.
Okay. Cool. Any other final thoughts on the British forces before we jump to DAC?
Yeah. Just a quick summary overall. We've basically toned up most of their underused units. We're hoping to see some shift in the meta in terms of how you use Brits. Now, we know we did put quite a few changes in, so we'll be keeping a close eye on in terms of how Brits kind of take off. Especially there's going to be kind of layers to this, where people are going to figure out how to use them, and then there's going to be a delay when people figure out how to play against them or not. And then from there, we'll have to kind of make adjustments.
Okay.
So yeah.
We do hope it will allow more gameplay styles with the British, though, with more emphasis on those
Yeah.
things that we have listed above. So we hope to see them more in the game.
Yeah, the emphasis is like less raw strength and more just the ability to go more of the options. So we'll definitely be tracking that.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about the Africa Corps. What's going on with our friends in the desert here? What kind of changes have we made to the deck?
Yeah.
So for the deck, we're doing some changes to lessen their power in that early start of the game where light vehicles start hitting the field, but also giving like their very late game options more use and more what's the word I'm looking for? Or just more viability for their like extreme late game
Yeah.
options, which were generally you would never go into like the Panzer Army Command for a lot of situations. So we're hoping to like tune that up.
Yeah. We're trying to round out because the deck right now relies on some really sharp edges that we're gonna dull a little bit because they're little like a lot too much of their gameplay kind of it revolves around exploiting very specific weaknesses. That player is really like if you don't know exactly what you're doing and your opponent knows a certain weakness and they exploit it, you can very much just lose the game outright. Which isn't kind of what we want. We want there to be a little bit more push and pull. We still want to reward DAC players for being aggressive like they are currently. But again, it's been a little too sharp. So we're kind of dulling those points. But in exchange for compensation, we're kind of increasing the endurance of the faction by giving their late game options and their side options a little bit more power. So going into some details here, before we talk about armored reserves, the first few major changes is we made the last tier cheaper, and we made the Panzerjäger squad quite a lot better in their AT role. So we've noted that in reverse, if DAC ever falls behind, they really struggle against light vehicles. Cough, Chaffee, cough. So like we're trying to give them a soft option that isn't just their mortar and their AT gun.
Right.
We've noted that the Panzerjäger can kind of get out tempoed by an armored player that's ahead. Like they can get vehicles faster than you can get AT, which isn't really what we want. If you really invest into AT as DAC, we still want you to be able to insulate yourself from that kind of threat. So that's kind of the major change there. And then also the change to the final tier is to make it so that you can transition into the later game much better in all game modes. So that you can use, for example, the P3 to kind of deal with some of those earlier threats. And also give a little better trade-off between early power and late game power of like, I want to just kill you in the first 15 minutes versus I will fight you up until 25 or 30.
Right. So Darren, do we want to get into some of those specific changes that are going to be coming?
Yeah. So in addition to what Jason mentioned, we are lowering the price of the Panzer Army commands for the final tier. We're also making it so armored reserves are going to give a much higher discount on what you get for them because you have to pay so much to unlock those abilities. It makes sense for these to have such a high discount on these units because for a lot of these units, if you're looking at the Wehrmacht, they would come much earlier for the Panzer IV and the Stug Gs. And the Panzer III is already available in the Panzer Army Command, so it makes no sense that you have paid armored reserves for this, but now you're also paying like that's pretty much the same cost of your Panzer or 3 and just a slight discount on the infantry. Now with this, like over the course of a longer game, DAC will have the ability to get like these discounted armor units. They're not going to be premium discounted armor units, but they are going to allow DAC to scale more into the late game when they're using these cheaper medium tank call-ins rather than going straight for the Tiger.
Yeah, we do want to reward players for using the non-Tiger options in that tier. So these changes should help that. Outside of that, we have some minor tweaks. I think we have a minor nerf to the 254 in particular. We're reducing the shell count on that because we've noticed that can be kind of devastating to certain emplacements, which was overperforming a little. One of the other things is that we've toned down the 250 in its early game. We've noted that the someone called it the flame chariot was a little too devastating early on. And it was particularly difficult to fight with small arm infantry. Like you have to use quite a lot of weird tactics to fight it. So while we still want to retain that gameplay of like using the 250 early, we don't want it to be like the only thing you do. So we've nerfed the armor on it by a bit, but we've also and so now it's much more reliant on getting the upgrade if you want to have strong early 250 play, which is still viable because it's fairly cheap. But yeah.
Because one thing we were noting is that mass small arms infantry fire at the front of a 250 was not enough to award it back.
It just
Right,
bounced
yeah.
off.
So you could have 2 squads trying to chase off the 250 with a flamethrower inside.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be enough to at least cause significant damage or make the DAC reconsider charging in. So it often relied on that the allied players had to have early anti-tank grenades to deal with the 250.
Yeah. Moving on from that, we have some minor changes to the flak half track. So we've decreased the speed and the excel, so basically the mobility of the unit. So it's a lot less slippery to its counters. So if you do get proper counters against it out, it's going to be significantly, or it'll be much harder for you to dance around them like you did before. And it also does mean that even if you don't have the counters out, the flak half track can't quite devastate the map as much as it could before. So these changes are kind of to tone back the performance of the unit while not nerfing its immediate power too much if you do employ it correctly.
Yeah, I think it did feel a little bit oppressive, maybe especially in against newer players that are a little bit less familiar with how to counter it. But
yeah, it was really good at dancing around its counters. So that's our main approach.
Okay.
With the acceleration changes overall to the game that are going to be coming as well, it should allow anti-tank guns if the flak is anywhere near, like just not at the very edge of the range, maybe at range 50. You're like that, you will generally be able to take out the flak with the second anti-tank gun shot unless it's upgraded. So this
Or
may make it much more difficult for the flak to dance around its counters. But there are also more counters to the flak, like the Humber, going to be available to say the
for the
British.
Brits. Yeah. Outside of just buffing the tier, we've also made the P3, the Panzer III, a little bit better. Mostly we've improved its anti-infantry performance by adjusting its machine guns ever so slightly. So that between that and it cheaper, hopefully, you could get them out earlier and they can justify their costs sooner.
Right.
Outside of that, we have some battle group changes. We have a minor change to the Caro, which standardizes its performance with some of the other light vehicles. And then we also have some changes for the Semovente, I believe.
Mainly just a standardization fix, because some effects were not properly applying, and now the Semovente will just track its targets. Because before, if you ran past the Semovente and didn't fire its heat round, it would not rotate.
We fixed that. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
The big one, though, is so the big power spike we're nerfing on the DAC, and it's coming up in the battle groups. It's the L640. So we are essentially not really changing the way it works. It already was geared toward fighting light vehicles to an extent, but we are pretty much removing its anti-infantry capability if you do not buy the flamethrower.
Okay.
One thing we're noticing with the L640, for its timing, and especially when it comes in pairs, it's too good against infantry, but you push it back 1 CP, it's not good enough for its timing. But if we just made it 1 tank, 1 L640 that hits the field, it's still devastating enough.
That caused all kinds of other problems it didn't really fix much. So the idea is we've actually made it a little bit cheaper now, but out the gate, you are no longer getting a dual use unit that you used to before. The guns on the vehicles are now tuned to be basically purely anti-vehicle. There's still a little bit of anti-infantry on the unit because they do have a coax, but it's nothing like it was before. So no more like you immediately see an L640, you retreat, and then you still lose the squad on retreat.
Yeah, it did always feel like this just massive power spike.
Yeah. So that should be gone. However, you can still have an early game power spike if you bring them out and then you get the flamethrowers on them. So that's very much still a thing, but that's much more expensive and it's also a bit slower.
Right.
So this way, players should have much more counterplay
And
hopefully.
you can also use your early light vehicles to counter the L640, where before like the double L640 would just outright counter the Humber,
Yeah,
and put some pressure on units like the Greyhound or anti-tank half-track.
yeah.
Ac- and
Sorry,
and
go ahead.
and yeah, we didn't feel that there needed to be more anti-infantry units for the DAC. Like you already have gustatory in the same part
Yes.
of the unlock tree, and there's about 3 other autocannon-based vehicles in
Yeah,
the DAC
yeah.
faction from the 259, the flak half-track, and the 8 rad. So there didn't need to be more like pressure units that the DAC have that all act very similarly or play very similarly.
Yeah. The other part is by keeping them AT, this is hopefully going to give it a unique role, even if you're past that shock timing of like getting it immediately onto CPs, because the vehicles are still fairly good against a lot of the anti-vehicle units.
Mm.
So we're hoping that's still an option, especially in support of the Guastatori, so that you can kind of use these units as a set and kind of they can mutually support each other. Or you could just go 4 flamethrowers and just absolutely toast people.
Sounds fun. Okay. Anything else about the L640, or do you want to cover the last 3 things?
No. We could move on to the armored support. I think the main change to this was the change to vehicle awareness, right, Darren?
Yeah, so we mainly changed vehicle awareness from just being a passive to the global, just so
Mhm.
it provides less information for the DAC over time, but it will allow us to increase the power of vehicle awareness
Mhm.
because we had to tone the range back quite a bit to the point where you didn't really notice it a lot, but by having it as a global that is not always going to be active, it gives us more room to provide it a bit more power, but also for a limited time.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then in a similar vein to Seek and Destroy, we're also making Panzerstorm's speed. We're toning it down ever so slightly, but we're moving some of those stats into other categories. So, for example, its rotation bonus is a little bit higher than it was before, but no more, well, not as speedy tanks.
Mhm.
Not quite. And in terms of Italian combined arms, we are... So we have some minor changes in store for this. We're still tracking it because we know there are some issues with it
Mhm.
that are a little bit more systemic. And yeah, not to get too much into other stuff. The main changes for this one is we nerfed Pact of Steel so that it wasn't quite as like you unlock light vehicle and then just spam light vehicle. It still will be there, but it should be a little bit weaker, and the alternative should be a little bit more attractive.
Okay.
And then we've also brought the artillery cover a little bit back in line. This is a little overpriced for what you got. Especially the delays on it seem to be a little bit overperforming, like overly long. So now it should feel much more effective as an Overwatch ability of like, hey, I need cover here, and it will properly suppress units in that area.
Yeah, so the big issue with Italian combined arms artillery cover not only was its price and the fact, of course, it competes with Pact of Steel currently, but is like it didn't really provide much of a zoning tool after you took the first shell from the respective artilleries, either the anti-tank or anti-infantry. It gave the player significant time to just run around in the Overwatch area without taking any fire.
Yeah.
And that's not what we want. These abilities are meant to zone people out, keep them out of specific areas. So that's why we significantly reduced the delay and also increased like the speed of the motor projectile. So when they are coming down, they're also going to hit their targets much faster.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So I think that kind of covers all of the specifics for our changes. Again, let's maybe just kind of quickly touch on your goals here. So it sounds like I said before, like we're really kind of buffing Brits, adjusting some of the battle groups. What are you kind of hoping players will experience with the Year-1 anniversary update, and specifically with a lot of the changes that you've both implemented here?
Yeah, we're trying to again, like, strategic diversity is kind of the goal. It's why we're here, right? Like the idea is the game will be much more interesting to play for everyone if you engage, if there's a variety of strategies that are all viable or they have interesting interactions with each other. Maybe strat A is good against strat B and then strat C, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of the idea. And we've noticed, particularly in the last patch, over time, we've kind of settled into kind of a rhythm of certain strats just being the thing. So we're hoping we can disrupt these
Mhm.
and then introduce some new ones, particularly for the Brits, which will kind of spice up the gameplay for everyone.
Mhm.
And in adjustment to all of those new strats, you have new strats coming out, and people can kind of, again, engage with the game in different ways. Yeah, that's kind of the main target of all of these changes. And also the experimental change, the
Yes,
Collins
yeah,
change.
I was going to say, are
Yeah.
we getting to that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I think now is we can finally discuss it a little bit more in detail.
I guess just for some context,
Right.
like the ongoing debate, I think, in the Company of Heroes community has always been around call-ins and
Yes.
essentially how they should be utilized, how they should be unlocked. You know, should
Mhm.
they be locked behind tech? You know, like I know our very competitive players have very strong thoughts about
Yes,
these.
they do.
But I also know that you know, our more social focused players, you know, people who are just maybe a little bit more casually engaging with the game, like really love call-ins because it's kind of like this, you know, great power fantasy and this just very exciting moment in any sort of match. So Darren, I know, or Jason, I know before when we were talking off mic, you kind of said we're trying to experiment with this like middle ground
Yes.
in the sort of debate, because I feel like a lot of the answers that players come up with is sort of like this one or the other.
Yes.
But it seems like you're trying to like walk this middle path. So can
Yeah.
you maybe describe what we're doing here?
Yeah. So battle groups offered us a unique opportunity to not quite take a hard line on either one.
Mhm.
I know there are a lot of players who do want one or the other, and we do acknowledge that. But right now, the idea is kind of like, can we kind of find a middle ground where we can actually get both kinds of this mechanic in, where you do have the ability to circumvent tech as an interesting way of the battle group interacting with your strategy, right? Like tech skipping, if you see an armored player, that is something that they could potentially do. But at the same time, we don't want them to make it, usually one of the biggest problems with these call-ins was that they would be the thing, right? They were often always the best strategy because that's kind of the highlight of the battle group. There was also this competing issue of like, that's kind of the cool unit. That's kind of the cool thing. So like, you don't want to just nerf it out of existence because then, I mean, then you're losing a core part of the commander in the past or the battle group in this case.
Right.
So the idea now is kind of like, can we find a middle ground where, hey, we allow you to get the unit through tech, but it's balanced differently than if you use the call-in. So the call-in is still available. This way we can balance both separate game styles in a way that we can kind of keep them equivalent, or around the ideas of like, hey, there are different ways of engaging, right?
Yeah.
So like you can either play mechanized or, for example, armored. So that's the two battle groups that have the changes this patch, with a style where you want to deliberately stall for the tech, or for the tech skip. And that's fine. We price it in. We price it in the CPs. We price it in maybe into the cost of the call-in. In reverse, we can also reward players who just want to use the E8, who aren't tech skipping, but by like, hey, you don't pay that extra cost. And by being able to tack a cost onto one thing and a lack of a cost into the different, or by costing them differently, we can equate them in power. So that way you can see both, which that's the hope. You know, there's a difference between on paper and also what happens in practice.
Right.
We've already noted that like both strats can be interesting, and also we also have the other issue of like we have multiple game modes that engage with these things differently. In certain modes or in certain metas, call-ins can be better or worse in certain scenarios, which is also a big challenge for us. We want all of the modes to be interesting and fun and engaging. We don't want it to where like, hey, this is a 1v1 thing, not for 4v4. Too bad. Or the reverse is like, oh, because this is really good in 4v4, you don't get it in 1v1.
Right.
We don't want either.
Right.
So hopefully by giving us more options, we can hopefully get these things in a better state where they're not like game ruining or just not existent.
Right. So let's
yeah.
take a step back and specifically talk about that option in like a practical sense. So
Yes.
Darren, I know when we were looking at the battle group trees, it looked like there was sort of an exclusive choice with both of those calling units. So Darren, can you explain like how does that actually practically work? Like, can I still call it in if I make the choice to have it as part of my sort of the, you know, my tech building, or is that does that sort of separate those options, and I have to kind of go one
You-
route or the other?
You pretty much have to go one route or the other. So I'm going to go with call-ins, or I'm going to build them from the production building.
Mhm.
For the most part, at least for the Wehrmacht, the difference between the two Panthers, there's no difference between the two Panthers at all.
Right now.
One just arrives from the call-in because you can possibly tech skip by playing extended Wehrmacht Tier 2 or Tier 3.
Mhm.
And with using the other call-ins in the mechanized battle group. For the Americans, it's a bit different. So they have the ability for their Shermans to call in with the engineer squad. But they also have the ability to now just build the E8 from the tank depot, which is also can be impacted by some of the abilities that are also in the armored battle group. So you got War Machine and Fast Deploy, and that is why like the E8 is costed a bit more in field than the Panther. We're at 110 because it is likely going to have that discounted manpower price
Right.
over time. Whereas the call-in for the E8 that actually has a lower fuel cost, but it has that higher CP cost because you obviously need to unlock it, and it has the higher manpower. Always just has the higher manpower cost because it comes with those engineers on the back.
Mhm. So I guess like from a player perspective, if I'm looking at this choice, I guess I basically have the option of, okay, do I just sort of hold out, hoard my resources, and then go for the call-in option? Maybe I'm on the back foot and I just kind of need to stall for a little bit. Or am I feeling like confident and, you know what, I actually just want this as an option as part of my production building?
Yep.
Is that sort of the choice that we're now
that's the
offering?
choice that you are generally making in terms of do I want to stall out, or do I want to just play the game normally, get all my production buildings, and eventually have this unit at the end. And this is going to make these units like the Panther and E8 appear a lot more in team games because generally you're able to escalate your resource lead much better than you are in 1v1 and then get to your end game production structure much faster. And depending on like how much action there is, team games you generate a bit less CP than 1v1 because you are constantly fighting in a 1v1.
Depends.
Yeah.
Unless you're always going to help your friend.
Yeah.
So.
Unless you're that guy who just keeps running his infantry and losing everything.
But just going back to your point, Jason, about cost, because let me actually change screens here. So if you look at the tree, it doesn't look like the right option has a CP cost. So that is essentially
a zero.
A free
right
choice.
now it's zero.
Okay.
So
Right
that's very much on purpose. And that's the current major price difference. For the mechanized, that's the only difference right now. But there is a minor cost difference for the armored one because the call-in comes with engineers as well. But you don't build engineers when you build it manually. But this also comes to the idea of like not punishing non-tech skipping players trying to get the unit. So like one of the complaints we've seen in team games, for example, is, hey, I don't get the chance to use the E8 much because it's so hard to kind of factor in because going like mass light vehicles wasn't as viable, for example, in team games. So going that strat of like mass light vehicles and kind of stalling until 20, 25 minutes and then going into E8 just wasn't that good in 4v4, which kind of made the E8 straight up just harder to get in the team game, which was kind of a shame, right? We didn't want that. So the idea now is that was kind of the issue with like these vehicle call-ins as well, was the idea that if you wanted to get the Panther or the E8, the best way to maximize that using that vehicle in your strategy almost always revolved around tech skipping. That's the best way to get the most value, right? And we had to balance around that because if we didn't, then they would be really OP in the scenarios where you were tech skipping. But now, the idea is we don't have to do that anymore. We can balance these two paths separately. And maybe in the future, we might have to give them a CP cost, or maybe we have to adjust the costs even more. But the idea is that we can now do them separately, which gives us the ability to balance them separately.
Right.
Which allows us to change that power for each player differently. So hopefully for like, let's say if we break players down into 3 camps here, if you were playing team games kind of more casually and you want to engage with the units, this is significantly more accessible.
Mhm.
You no longer need to wait until you get to the 20-25 minute mark, especially if it's a slower game, to get an E8. I think it's currently 3 CPs quickest if you really, really want it early. 3 CPs, and then you have to get the tech costs.
Right.
So it's more tech cost constraint than CP. And for the Panther, I think it's 6 or 5, something similar. So that way, in team games, if you're a casual player, you can get them early. Then you have the more competitive, but you'll also have the non-1v, like hardcore 1v1 tech skipping players. You can now incorporate these units into your strategy, but you have to build them through the hard tech. So you can, for example, you can be like, I will fast tech to tier 4 as Wehrmacht, but I will get Panthers. Like Panther Broombar combo, for example.
Right.
And you're no longer punished.
Yeah.
And then finally, you can still do tech skipping because we didn't remove that from the game. And that's still very much it has its presence in, for example, high-level multiplayer.
Right. Darren, I'm kind of curious, Darren, what do you think some of the results are going to be from this change? Like, do you think, or like, how do you envision players sort of interacting with these systems?
I primarily see this being more impactful in the team game area because that's where people generally want these bigger and heavier vehicles to appear, or that's where they will primarily shine because you will be able to unlock them and it will be able to like surprise players or like, oh, the guy went Matilda, but now the Wehrmacht has an option in one of their battle groups to counteract that with just like a very early Panther, or because that is available. But it does have some use in 1v1 as well in the traditional or like built old play style because maybe you went down like the entire right tree of mechanized to focus on that, and maybe you started only just going into the left tree, but you have your tier up. It's going to be much easier to say get the Panther or E8 out in those sort of scenarios, was where you have decided to go the other tree.
Yeah.
So it should also make it so that like getting these units, like you don't have to just, all right, I have to go down this side of the tree from the start of the game to the very end before I can unlock that. Like I can't touch anything on the other side of the tree, or that will just eat up too many of my command points before I can unlock these like heavy end game vehicles.
Right. Yeah. I definitely found myself sort of like looking at that bottom of the tree and being like, all right, I'm just going to have to save all my CP to get there.
It should also create a bit more, also, I guess, end game diversity for the factions, even in 1v1. So you'll have the Panther, so that will counter like units like the newly updated Grant, the Matilda. I can fight off the Hellcat and deal with most of the Sherman variants, but in return, it does provide an interesting thing because the Panther itself is primarily anti-armor vehicle, but unlike the Panzer IV, or it can't really deal with infantry as well.
No.
Whereas the E8 is a more premium tank and does well against everything, but obviously you pay that premium for building it normally from the tank depot over like the specialist dozer, the standard cheaper standard Sherman, or the specialist anti-tank Hellcat.
Okay.
And in terms of like playstyle, we've always wanted the heavy armor battle groups to kind of have two playstyles of like either it enabled you to kind of go harder into mid-game units, which was the role of tech skipping, right? We wanted to have a playstyle where, hey, you can go like maybe not 6, but like 3 Chaffies and a Greyhound and really play for that for like 20 minutes and then go into your late game vehicles. We wanted that to be viable, but we also didn't want that to be the only way you could engage with the battle group, which for a lesser or a longer extent, that's kind of been the case. The idea is that the armored battle group for US in particular can also support this idea of like this late game juggernaut of like you have really good Shermans that are better than everyone else's and like quite a few powerful abilities to support them. Like Strength and Steel has been slept on a little bit because it's 1 CP cost higher originally, but the idea that allows you to have a larger maximum army, which is really cool, but you know, in a limited scenario. And then also we have like field repairs, which is a really powerful ability, but it hasn't been used as much because people are rushing to War Machine, for example.
Right.
But now we wanted so that like, hey, no, we want to allow you to go for that late game style, maybe not in all of your 1v1 games, but maybe in your 2v2, 3v3s, like there's a play style where like, hey, my teammate goes something early and they help me scale into something where I'm stronger late. And we, that's kind of the vision.
Yeah.
But we know there's quite a lot of steps before we get there. We're not thinking like, oh, this change will immediately fix everything.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is the nature of balance. We want to be making changes, but this is kind of like where we want to go. Right. We want to go to a place where there's plenty of strategies and also there's plenty of dynamics where like you have emphasis on early strength, late game strength, mid game strength. And you can choose as a player like what you want to do and also what your opponents do, and you have to kind of back and forth.
Okay.
And that's the perfect vision, but that's the blue sky of us designers.
Yeah. Insert the Thanos meme of perfectly balanced. Jason, I think one of the things you said is that this is also an experimental change.
Yes.
I think the team is open to trying this out, maybe doing more of it, maybe doing less of it, maybe adjusting it in the future. So, did you have any sort of anything else that you wanted to say around that, just to maybe so that we're not scaring people with this changes today?
Yeah. So, what's the best way of putting this? Like this is an experimental change, like we're calling it such. So we're going to be tracking like, hey, does it make the game better? Does it make the game worse? All that I ask is that I hope players engage with it with a bit of an open mind. Test it a little bit back and forth if it's strong or if it's weak. And then we'll kind of adjust depending on how people react to it, how people engage with it. And yeah, pretty much.
The big thing with this is like you're not losing in your anything in your battle group in return for having the
we gave you something extra.
The battle group system allows us to do this, where if we were to do this in Company of Heroes 2, we'd have to remove one of the abilities.
Yes.
Commanders have 5 items and they're all in a linear tree. There is no pick option between the various
this is a
items.
unique opportunity that the battle group system kind of offered us. So yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. Any final thoughts on this call-in change before we wrap up?
Honestly, I think I ranted a little bit too much.
Okay. Well, that's great. So again, folks, if you want to stay up to date on everything Company of Heroes 3, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Company of Heroes. Join our Discord where you can debate balance endlessly with other players. Discord.gg/Company of Heroes. Follow us right here on Twitch at twitch.tv/Company of Heroes. And of course, find the patch notes on our forums at community.companyofheroes.com. So I think that's going to be it for today. Don't forget to check out our last live stream where we do a deep dive on all the new and classic maps that are coming to Company of Heroes 3. You can dive into that new content plus all the changes that we discussed here when the update patch goes live today. And also don't forget our frontline mobilization community social challenge is also starting today. So if players can collectively come together and complete it before March 5th, we're going to be unlocking a new legendary profile badge, banner, and title for all players. So you can head to our social channels to get all the details. But I think that's it for today. So thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Darren. And happy playing, folks. We'll see you next time.